My name is Amara, and I'm about to tell you the story of how my father's love reached from beyond the grave to deliver the most devastating revenge I've ever witnessed. But first, let me take you back to the worst day of my life, the day I buried the only person who ever truly saw me as family, and the day his so-called relatives showed me exactly who they really were. The funeral home smelled like lilies and lies. I stood there in my black dress, the one my father had bought me for my college graduation 3 years ago, watching as people who barely spoke to him while he was alive suddenly became his closest confidants in death. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the adopted daughter, the outsider, the one they whispered about at family gatherings, and I was the only one genuinely mourning Robert Brandt. You see, my father, and yes, he was my father in every way that mattered, had built an empire from nothing. Brandt Industries wasn't just a company. It was a legacy carved from determination, intelligence, and an understanding of human nature that most people never develop. He'd started with a single construction contract 35 years ago and built it into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that employed thousands and shaped skylines across 3 states. But more than that, he'd built something else. He'd built me into the person I was meant to be. I was 8 years old when Robert and his wife, Margaret, adopted me from the foster system. I remember the day clearly, because it was the first time an adult had ever looked at me and seen potential instead of problems. Margaret died when I was 12. Cancer, quick and brutal. Leaving just Robert and me in that massive house on Elm Ridge. That's when our real relationship began. That's when he stopped being my adoptive father and became simply my dad. The years that followed were filled with late-night conversations about business, about life, about the nature of family and loyalty. He taught me to read financial statements like other fathers teach their daughters to ride bikes. He showed me how to spot a liar from across a boardroom, how to negotiate from a position of strength even when you feel weak, and most importantly, how to recognize the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them. Amara, he'd say during those long evenings in his study, family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them most. It's about who celebrates your victories without jealousy and who stands by you during your failures without judgment. Remember that, because someday you're going to need to know the difference. I thought I understood what he meant then. I had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The morning of the funeral, I woke up in my childhood bedroom for what I somehow knew would be the last time. The house felt different without him in it. Hollow, like an echo chamber of memories. I could still smell his cologne in the hallway, still hear the phantom sound of his morning coffee routine drifting up from the kitchen. Grief, I discovered, has a physical weight. It sits on your chest like a stone, making every breath a conscious effort. I'd been living in Chicago for the past 3 years, working at a financial consulting firm and building my own reputation in the industry. Dad had been so proud when I'd landed that job, not because he'd pulled strings, he hadn't, but because I'd earned it on my own merit. "That's my girl," he'd said over the phone when I called to tell him. "You're going to change the world, Amara. I can feel it." Now I was back in Millbrook, the small but affluent town where I'd grown up, surrounded by people who'd never quite known what to make of me. The Brandt family had been a fixture in this community for generations. Well, Robert's side had, anyway. His great-grandfather had started the family's first business ventures here, and the name carried weight in local circles. But I'd always been the anomaly, the adopted black daughter in a family tree of pale faces and old money pretensions. The funeral service itself was a blur of expensive flowers, orchestrated grief, and carefully worded eulogies that managed to make Robert sound like a saint, while somehow never mentioning the parts of him that actually mattered. His brother James spoke about his dedication to family values, which would have made Dad laugh, given that James had shown up at family dinners exactly twice in the past 5 years. His sister Patricia rambled about his generous spirit, conveniently forgetting that she'd spent the last decade asking him for loans she never intended to repay. I sat in the front row, alone. They'd offered to let some of the extended family sit with me, but I'd declined. This wasn't their grief to share. They barely knew him. They knew Robert Brandt, the successful businessman, the man who wrote checks at charity galas, and whose name appeared on the society pages. I knew Robert Brandt, the man who made terrible dad jokes at breakfast, who cried during sad movies when he thought no one was looking, and who stayed up all night when I had the flu, checking my temperature every 2 hours. After the service, everyone migrated to the family estate for the reception. The house looked exactly as it had during my childhood. Imposing stone facade, perfectly manicured gardens, and rooms that seemed designed more for impressing visitors than for actual living. But it had been home, because he was there. The gathering was a strange mix of business associates, distant relatives, and social climbers who detached themselves to the Brandt name over the years. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences from people whose names I couldn't remember, and listening to stories about my father that bore little resemblance to the man I'd known and loved. That's when I noticed them. The whispers, the sidelong glances, the little huddles of conversation that would disperse when I approached. At first, I thought it was normal funeral behavior, the kind of awkward social dynamics that emerge when death forces people together who'd rather be anywhere else. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to catch fragments of conversations that made my stomach turn. Of course, she's not really family. Adopted, when she was older. It's such a shame about the inheritance situation. Robert was always too soft-hearted for his own good. I retreated to the library, Dad's favorite room in the house, seeking refuge among his books and the familiar smell of leather and wood polish. This was where we'd had our most important conversations, where he'd taught me about business and life, and the complicated dance of human relationships. The walls were lined with first editions and business journals, family photos and awards from various civic organizations. But dominating the room was his massive oak desk, still scattered with the papers he'd been working on before his heart attack. I was standing there, running my fingers along the edge of that desk and trying not to cry, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Catherine Brandt Morrison, Robert's younger sister and the unofficial matriarch of the extended family since their parents had died. Catherine had always been polite to me in that particular way that wealthy white women perfect. The kind of politeness that maintains social conventions while making it crystal clear that you don't actually belong. She was perfectly put together as always. Not a hair out of place despite the emotional trauma of supposedly losing her beloved brother. Her black dress probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her makeup had been applied with the skill of someone who understood that grief was a performance, and she had an audience to consider. "Amara, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sympathy that makes your skin crawl. "I've been looking for you. How are you holding up? I should have known what was coming." Looking back, all the signs were there. The way she'd positioned herself between me and the other family members all afternoon. The careful way she'd been managing conversations. The little looks she'd exchanged with her siblings and cousins. But I was drowning in grief. Vulnerable in a way I'd never been before. And stupidly, naively, I thought she was offering genuine comfort. I started, then stopped. How do you explain that kind of loss to someone who's never experienced unconditional love? "I'm trying to take it one moment at a time." Catherine nodded with practiced understanding, moving closer until she was standing right next to me. The library suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, and I realized this conversation wasn't happening by accident. She'd orchestrated this moment, chosen this location, timed this interaction with the precision of a chess master moving pieces across a board. "I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you," she continued, her tone remaining gentle and concerned. "Robert loved you so much. We all know that. He was always so proud of you, always talking about your achievements and your potential." There was something in the way she said "proud of you" that made me wary. It carried undertones, implications that I couldn't quite identify but that made my instincts scream warnings I was too emotionally exhausted to properly process. "He was a wonderful father," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, he was. And I want you to know that we all see how much you meant to him. That bond you two shared was special." She paused, as if choosing her next words very carefully. "But Amara, sweetheart, we need to talk about what happens next, about the future." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about comfort or sympathy or shared grief. This was about money. This was about the Brandt fortune and who would control it, and how they could minimize my role in that equation. The realization felt like ice water in my veins, shocking me into a clarity I'd been lacking all day. Catherine must have seen something change in my expression because she quickly pressed on, as if rushing to get her message delivered before I could fully process what was happening. I know this is a terrible time to discuss practical matters, but there are decisions that need to be made about the business, about the estate, about everything. And while we all know how much Robert cared for you, the reality is that managing an empire like Brandt Industries requires a certain kind of background, a certain understanding of family legacy and tradition. She was still speaking in that soft, sympathetic tone, but her words were landing like physical blows. Each carefully chosen phrase was designed to sound reasonable while delivering a message that was anything but. She was telling me, in the most polite way possible, that I didn't belong, that despite being Robert's daughter for over 20 years, despite being the person he'd invested his time and energy and love in, I wasn't really family when it mattered. The truth is, darling, Catherine continued, there are aspects of the Brandt legacy that go back generations, responsibilities and expectations that come with the name, traditions that need to be preserved. It's not about love or affection. We all know Robert adored you, but leadership of this family, stewardship of what we've built together, that requires a different kind of connection. I stared at her, unable to speak, unable to fully process what I was hearing. This woman, whose brother had just been buried, whose brother had spent decades building something meaningful and significant, was standing in his library on the day of his funeral and explaining to me why I wasn't worthy of his legacy. But she wasn't finished. Catherine stepped even closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume and see the calculated coldness behind her sympathetic expression. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if she were sharing an intimate secret rather than delivering a crushing blow. I know you loved him, dear, and I know he loved you in his way, but you have to understand. She paused, letting the silence stretch between us like a blade. You'll never be one of us. The words hit me like a physical assault, not because they were unexpected. Some part of me had always known that the extended Brandt family saw me as an outsider, but because of when she chose to say them, on the day we buried my father, in his favorite room, while I was at my most vulnerable and grief-stricken. But what made it truly devastating wasn't just the cruelty of the timing or the calculated precision of her delivery. It was the way she said it, with pity, as if she were delivering unfortunate news rather than a deliberate insult, as if she were helping me understand a difficult truth rather than attempting to destroy what little sense of belonging I had left. You'll never be one of us. The phrase echoed in my mind as Catherine squeezed my shoulder in what I'm sure she thought was a comforting gesture, then glided out of the library to rejoin the reception. I stood there alone, surrounded by my father's books and memories, feeling more isolated than I had since those early days in foster care, when I'd learned that family was something that happened to other people. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to build inside me, not just hurt or anger, though both of those were certainly present, something deeper, more complex, a recognition that this moment was exactly what my father had been preparing me for all these years. All those conversations about the nature of family, all those lessons about recognizing people's true motivations, all those warnings about the difference between those who love you and those who love what you represent. He'd known. Somehow Robert had known this day would come, and he'd spent years making sure I would be ready for it. If you're someone who's ever felt like an outsider in your own family, if you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in spaces where you have every right to exist, then you understand what I was experiencing in that moment. And if you want to hear stories about people who refuse to let others define their worth, people who turn their outsider status into their greatest strength, then you need to subscribe to Black Revenge Diaries. Because what happened next in my story is just the beginning of understanding how powerful it can be when someone underestimates you. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations. I moved through the crowd like an automaton, thanking people for their condolences and accepting their meaningless platitudes about Robert's legacy and my loss. But inside, I was replaying every interaction I'd had with the extended family over the years, seeing them now through the lens of Catherine's revelation. The Christmas dinners, where I'd always felt slightly out of place. The family photos where I was positioned just slightly apart from the main group. The business conversations that would pause when I entered a room. It all made sense now. I hadn't been imagining the distance. I hadn't been oversensitive or paranoid. They had always seen me as temporary, as someone who didn't quite fit into their carefully constructed family narrative. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself studying their faces, listening to their conversations with new ears. James Brandt, Robert's older brother and current vice president of the company, was holding court near the fireplace, regaling a group of business associates with stories about the challenges facing Brandt Industries in the coming months. Patricia Brandt Coleman was working the room like a political candidate, making sure everyone knew how devastated she was by her brother's passing, while somehow managing to mention her own charitable work in every conversation. Then there were the cousins, Catherine's children and James's kids, all in their 30s and 40s, all perfectly groomed and professionally successful, and utterly convinced of their own importance. They moved through the reception with the confidence of people who'd never questioned their place in the world, never wondered if they belonged, never had to prove their worth to people who should have loved them unconditionally. But what struck me most was how little they actually talked about Robert the person. They discussed his business achievements, his civic contributions, his role in maintaining the family's social standing. But no one mentioned his terrible cooking experiments on Sunday mornings, or his habit of leaving business magazines scattered throughout the house, or the way he'd light up when explaining some complex financial concept he'd just figured out. They were mourning Robert Brandt, the institution, not Robert Brandt, the man. And that's when I began to understand that Catherine's words weren't just cruel. They were stupid. She was so focused on bloodlines and traditions and social standing that she'd completely missed what actually made Robert special. She saw his empire and wanted to control it, but she had no understanding of the principles and values that had built it in the first place. As the reception finally began to wind down, I retreated to my old bedroom to change out of my funeral dress and try to process everything that had happened. The room looked exactly as I'd left it when I'd moved to Chicago. The same books on the shelves, the same photos on the desk, the same sense of being a space where I'd been truly accepted and loved. I was folding my dress when I found the letter. It was tucked into the inside pocket, written in Robert's familiar handwriting on his personal stationery. My hands shook as I unfolded it, recognizing immediately that this was something he'd planned, something he'd arranged for me to find at exactly this moment. "My dearest Amara," it began, "if you're reading this, then the day we both knew would eventually come has arrived. I hope the funeral wasn't too terrible. I know how much you hate those kinds of formal affairs. I hope you wore the black dress I bought you for graduation. You looked so beautiful and so strong in that dress, and I have a feeling you're going to need that strength today. I imagine by now you've begun to understand what kind of people my biological family really are. I imagine they've started to show you their true colors, started to make you feel like you don't belong, started to suggest that being my daughter isn't enough to make you a real Brandt. I'm sorry you have to experience that, sweetheart. I wish I could have protected you from it entirely. But some lessons can only be learned through experience. What I can do is remind you of something I've told you 1,000 times, but that you might need to hear again right now. You are not just my daughter. You are my legacy. You are everything I hope to accomplish as a father and as a man. Every value I hold dear, every principle I've tried to live by, every dream I've had for the future. All of that lives in you. The people who will try to make you feel small, who will suggest that blood matters more than love, who will attempt to exclude you from what we've built together, those people don't understand the first thing about family or legacy, or what it means to build something that lasts. They see an empire and want to inherit it. You see the principles behind the empire and have the capacity to expand it. I have one more gift for you, Amara. One final lesson and one final surprise. Trust me when I tell you that everything is going to be okay. More than okay. Tomorrow, when Mr. Henley reads the will, you're going to understand just how much faith I have in you, and just how little I think of people who mistake birthright for worthiness. You'll never be one of them, sweetheart. Thank God for that. You're so much more. All my love always, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, crying harder with each pass. But by the 3rd reading, the tears weren't just from grief anymore. They were from something else. A recognition. A preparation. A sense that Robert had once again managed to give me exactly what I needed. exactly when I needed it. The letter was dated 3 months ago, which meant he'd written it around the time of his first heart episode. He'd known his time was limited, and he'd used that knowledge to prepare for this moment. Even in death, he was still taking care of me, still teaching me, still making sure I understood my own worth, even when others tried to diminish it. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Catherine's words, about the letter, about the will reading that was scheduled for the next morning. Robert had hinted at surprises, but I had no idea what to expect. All I knew was that in a few hours, I would be sitting in a room full of people who saw me as an interloper, while lawyers determined how much of my father's life work I would be allowed to inherit. The morning of the will reading dawned gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully, not in morning clothes this time, but in a navy blue suit that Robert had helped me pick out for job interviews. "You look like someone who could run the world in that suit," he'd said when I'd tried it on. Confident, competent, and completely unimpressed by people who think they're more important than they actually are. The reading was scheduled to take place in the library at the estate, the same room where Catherine had delivered her cruel message the day before. I arrived early, partly to prepare myself mentally, and partly because I wanted a few minutes alone in that space, before it filled with people who questioned my right to be there. The room had been rearranged slightly. Chairs arranged in a semicircle facing Robert's desk, where Mr. Henley, the family lawyer, would presumably sit while reading the will. But what caught my attention was something new: a large flat-screen television mounted on the wall behind the desk, connected to what appeared to be some kind of video equipment. I was still puzzling over this setup when the family began to arrive. James came first, accompanied by his wife Susan and their 2 adult children. Then Patricia with her husband and daughter. Catherine arrived with her son Michael and daughter Sarah, both of whom worked in various capacities for Brandt Industries. There were also a few other relatives, cousins and second cousins and family friends who'd apparently been included in whatever Robert had planned. The atmosphere was tense but expectant. These people weren't here to mourn. They were here to claim their inheritance. I could see it in their faces, in the way they positioned themselves around the room, in the little conversations they held in hushed tones while waiting for the proceedings to begin. I took a seat near the back, partly out of courtesy, and partly because I wanted to be able to observe everyone's reactions to whatever was about to unfold. Catherine caught my eye as she settled into a chair in the front row, giving me one of those polite smiles that somehow managed to be more insulting than an outright sneer. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mr. Henley entered the room carrying a leather portfolio and looking more formal than I'd ever seen him. He'd been Robert's lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning, and I'd always thought of him as almost part of the family. But today, he looked like what he was: a professional executor carrying out his client's final wishes, regardless of how those wishes might be received. "Good morning, everyone," he began, settling himself behind Robert's desk and opening his portfolio. "Thank you all for being here. I know this is a difficult time for the family, but Robert was very specific about how he wanted his final wishes to be communicated. Before I begin reading the formal will," Mr. Henley continued, "I need to inform you that Robert left very specific instructions about the order of proceedings this morning. He requested that we begin not with the legal document, but with what he called his final message, a video recording that he made approximately 6 weeks before his death." A murmur ran through the room. Several family members exchanged glances, and I saw Catherine lean forward in her chair with interest. This was clearly news to everyone, including me. "The recording is approximately 15 minutes long," Mr. Henley explained, "and Robert was very clear that it should be viewed in its entirety before we proceed with the formal reading. He also specified that no one should leave the room during the video, and that there should be no interruptions or discussions until it's finished." He moved to the video equipment behind the desk, and the large screen flickered to life. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then the image resolved, and there was Robert. He was sitting in this very room, in the chair behind his desk, wearing a dark blue suit and looking directly into the camera. But this wasn't the robust, energetic man I remembered. This Robert looked older, more fragile, with the kind of weariness that comes from knowing your time is limited. Still, his eyes were sharp and alert, and when he spoke, his voice was strong and clear. "Hello, everyone. If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you're all gathered here to find out what happens to everything I've built over the past 35 years. I imagine there are some expectations in that room, some assumptions about how this process will unfold. I hope you'll indulge me for a few minutes while I share some thoughts about family, legacy, and what it really means to carry on someone's life work." He paused, and I could swear he was looking directly at me through the screen, even though I knew the video had been recorded weeks ago. I've been thinking a lot lately about what makes someone family. Is it blood? Is it shared history? Is it legal documentation? Or is it something deeper? Shared values? Mutual respect? Genuine care for each other's well-being? I think most of you know which of those I value most. Around the room, I could sense people shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't the sentimental farewell message they'd been expecting. Over the years, I've watched my biological relatives, and yes, I'm talking about most of you in this room, treat my daughter Amara as if she were somehow less than a real member of this family. I've listened to the whispered comments, observed the subtle exclusions, noticed the way conversations change when she enters a room. I've seen you perform affection for her when it serves your purposes, and withdraw it when you think no one is paying attention. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Catherine's face had gone pale, and James was staring at the screen with an expression of growing alarm. "I want to be very clear about something," Robert continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Amara didn't become my daughter when I signed adoption papers. She became my daughter the moment I realized she had more integrity, intelligence, and genuine compassion than the rest of you combined. She became my legacy the day I understood that she was the only person in this family who shared my actual values, rather than just my bank account." I was crying now, not from grief, but from a complicated mix of love and validation and amazement at Robert's ability to reach across death to defend me. "Which brings me to the purpose of this message," he continued. "You see, I've spent the last several months putting my affairs in order, not just legally, but ethically. I've been making decisions about who deserves to inherit what I've built, and those decisions weren't based on bloodlines or birth certificates or family trees. They were based on character. The silence in the room was absolute. No one was breathing. No one was moving. Everyone was staring at the screen with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. I know that some of you, particularly you, Catherine, have already begun positioning yourselves to minimize Amara's role in the family business. I know you've started having conversations about the inheritance situation and the challenges of having someone so young and inexperienced in a position of authority. I know because I've been having those same conversations with my business associates and legal advisors, except from a very different perspective. Robert leaned forward in his chair, and his expression became more intense, more focused. What you don't understand is that for the past 5 years, Amara has been more involved in the strategic direction of Brandt Industries than any of you. She's reviewed every major contract, consulted on every significant acquisition, and provided input on every important hiring decision. Her financial analysis of the Morrison deal saved us $12 million. Her insights into the Chicago market expansion identified opportunities that our professional consultants missed. Her understanding of sustainable construction practices positioned us ahead of industry trends that are just now becoming standard. I was as shocked as anyone else in the room. I'd known Robert valued my opinions and appreciated my business education, but I had no idea how seriously he'd been taking my input, or how much influence I'd actually had on company decisions. "The truth is," Robert continued, "Amara has been functioning as my unofficial successor for years. She just didn't know it, and neither did any of you, because I wanted her to develop her skills and confidence without the pressure of family politics and jealousy. I wanted her to prove herself based on merit alone, without anyone being able to claim she was being given opportunities she hadn't earned." Catherine made a small, strangled sound, but she didn't speak. No one spoke. We were all too stunned, too focused on what Robert might say next. But now it's time to make things official. It's time to stop pretending that blood relationships matter more than actual qualifications. It's time to acknowledge that the future of this company, and this family, depends not on maintaining traditions, but on embracing change and growth and innovation. Robert sat back in his chair, and for the first time since the video began, he smiled. Not a sad or wistful smile, but something sharp and satisfied, like someone who just played a winning hand in a very high-stakes game. So here's what's going to happen. When Mr. Henley reads my will in a few minutes, you're going to learn that Amara Brandt, and yes, her legal name is Brandt, which some of you seem to have forgotten, is inheriting controlling interest in Brandt Industries. 60% of all company stock, voting rights on all major decisions, and the authority to hire and fire executive staff as she sees fit. The room exploded. James shot to his feet. Patricia gasped audibly, and Catherine made a sound like she was being physically strangled. Michael and Sarah looked like they'd been slapped, and several of the other relatives began talking at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock and outrage. But Robert's voice cut through the chaos, even though he was speaking from a recording made weeks ago. I know some of you are upset right now. I know you're feeling like this is unfair, like you're being punished for something you didn't do. But I want you to think very carefully about your reactions. Are you upset because you genuinely believe Amara isn't qualified to lead this company? Or are you upset because you assumed you would inherit something you never actually earned? That question hung in the air like a challenge, and one by one, the voices died down as people realized how their outrage might be interpreted. Amara, Robert said, and now he was looking directly into the camera again, speaking to me across time and death and the hatred radiating from his biological family. I know this is a shock. I know you probably don't feel ready for this responsibility, but I want you to remember something. I have never, in 22 years, seen you fail at anything you set your mind to accomplish. I have never seen you give up when things got difficult, never seen you compromise your principles for convenience, never seen you treat people poorly because you had the power to do so. I was sobbing now, unable to stop the tears or catch my breath. This was so much more than I'd ever imagined, so much more than I'd ever dared to hope for. You are going to be an extraordinary leader, Robert continued. Not because I'm giving you this opportunity, but because you've already proven you have the intelligence, integrity, and vision necessary for the job. The company isn't a gift I'm giving you. It's a responsibility you've already earned. But he wasn't finished. Robert's expression grew more serious, more focused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. As for the rest of you, you have choices to make. You can accept Amara's leadership and find ways to contribute positively to the company's future. You can continue to work within Brandt Industries under her direction, proving your value through your actions rather than your birth certificates. Or you can allow your resentment and prejudice to guide your decisions, in which case you'll find yourselves looking for employment elsewhere. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Robert was offering his biological family a chance to stay involved in the company, but only if they could treat me with the respect and professional courtesy they'd always denied. I want to be very clear about this, he continued. Amara has my full authorization to restructure the company as she sees fit. If that means removing family members from positions they're not qualified for, so be it. If it means bringing in outside talent to fill roles that require expertise you don't possess, so be it. This company will be run based on competence and merit, not on family connections or sense of entitlement. Catherine was staring at the screen with undisguised hatred, but she still hadn't spoken. None of them had spoken since their initial outburst. They were all too busy calculating, too busy trying to figure out how to respond to this complete upending of their expectations. There's one more thing I want to address, Robert said, and his tone became even more serious. Amara, I know that some members of this family have already begun to make you feel unwelcome, to suggest that you don't belong, to imply that being adopted makes you somehow less than a real Brandt. I know because they've been doing it for 20 years, and I know because they're predictable in their pettiness. He leaned forward again, his eyes intense and focused. I want you to remember something. You didn't join this family. You created it. Before you came into my life, the Brandt name was associated with a successful business, but not with honor, not with integrity, not with genuine care for others. You taught me what it meant to be a real father. You showed me what unconditional love looks like. You transformed me from a wealthy man into a truly rich one. I couldn't see the screen anymore through my tears, but I could hear every word, could feel the love and pride in Robert's voice reaching across the impossible distance between life and death. You don't need to prove you belong in this family, sweetheart. This family belongs to you. It exists because of the love and values and principles you brought into it. And anyone who can't see that, anyone who can't appreciate what an extraordinary gift it is to be connected to you, well, they're the ones who don't belong. Robert sat back in his chair and smiled again, but this time it was the warm, loving smile I remembered from 1,000 shared moments. I love you, Amara. I'm proud of you. I believe in you. And I can't wait to see what you do with the empire we built together. Change everything, sweetheart. Make it better. Make it yours. The screen went dark. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. We all just sat there in the aftermath of Robert's final message, trying to process what we just witnessed. Finally, Mr. Henley cleared his throat and opened his portfolio. "Well," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I suppose we should proceed with the formal reading of the will." What followed was largely a confirmation of what Robert had already announced in his video. Controlling interest in Brandt Industries to me, along with the family,